The early morning wind swept through the valley, sharp as a knife, carrying with it the bite of frost and the faint, metallic scent of dried blood. Elias Ward slowed his horse at the rise. Ahead, through the gray veil of dawn, the cabin he had inherited from his uncle came into view. For a heartbeat, he thought his weary eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, it was real. 5 women hung from ropes strung across the front gate. Their dresses, torn and faded, fluttered in the bitter wind. Bare feet dangled above the frozen earth. Their hair spilled forward like a shroud, hiding faces that had once belonged to mothers, sisters, daughters. Pinned to each chest was a splintered plank of wood, burned letters carved deep into the grain. "This ain't your land. What belongs to Morrison will always belong to Morrison." Elias's silver-gray eyes narrowed. This land had been promised to him as a chance at a new life after the war. Instead, the first thing it offered was death nailed to his gate. His horse snorted nervously, hooves pawing at the frost. Elias swung down, boots crunching in the dirt. His hand shook as he reached for the neck of the nearest woman. Beneath the rope-burned skin, a faint pulse answered. "Alive!" Another flicker, then another. The rope was meant to kill them, but not quickly. It was meant as a warning. He drew his knife, the blade catching the weak dawn light. Cut them down, and he would be stepping into a storm. Leave them, and he would no longer be a man. If it were you, standing in front of that gate with the wind in your face, what would you do? Elias stood there in the biting wind, his knife trembling in his calloused hand. The valley was silent except for the ropes creaking under the weight of 5 half-living bodies. The faintest breaths, ragged and uneven, pushed against the noose's grip. They weren't gone yet. Not all the way. Something deep in his chest told him he didn't stumble upon this scene by accident. He was being dared tested to decide whether he was a man who looked away or one who stood and fought. The first cut came quick. The blade flashed and the rope snapped with a sharp crack. The woman dropped like dead weight, but Elias lunged forward, catching her before she hit the frozen dirt. Her head lolled against his shoulder, long black hair tangled, a livid red mark circling her neck like a brand. Her lips were split and dry, but he heard the faint pull of breath. Still alive. One after another, he moved down the line. Each rope sliced open, each body lowered gently, his arms straining against weight that felt heavier than bone. By the time the last woman lay at his feet, Elias was panting hard, chest heaving in the cold dawn. The ground before the cabin gate looked like a battlefield. 5 broken soldiers, lined in silence, but still clinging to the smallest spark of life. He crouched beside them, hands working fast to cut the leather thongs, binding their wrists and ankles. When the rope fell away, the truth carved itself into his eyes. Bruises bloomed across pale skin like purple storms. Lashes crisscrossed their backs and arms, cruel welts meant to shame and silence. Someone had taken pleasure in this suffering. Whoever did this hadn't just tried to kill them, they'd tried to erase them. The black-haired woman stirred first. Even half-conscious, there was steel in her sharp eyes. A gash sliced across her cheek, still oozing faintly, but her jaw tightened with the set of a fighter. Her breath rattled, but her spirit hadn't broken. Beside her lay another hair the color of fire. Though her lips were cracked, her posture, even in collapse, carried defiance. Rage flickered behind half-closed lids, as if even dying, she was plotting vengeance. The third was a slip of a figure, golden blonde hair, matted with dirt and blood. Her face, soft and delicate, still held a grace that refused to be buried beneath pain. Her slender fingers clenched a torn scarf as though it were the last thread tying her to this world. The fourth was harder to read. Dark eyes half hidden under bruises, her silence wasn't weakness but calculation. There was something dangerous about her stillness, like a coiled snake waiting for its moment. Even half dead, she carried secrets. And the last, chestnut hair streaked with gray, was older. Lines traced her face, but there was strength there too, the kind that endures storms. The way her hand reached faintly toward the others, even in unconsciousness, marked her as the anchor, the one who had held them together through hell. Elias worked quickly. The dawn was thinning, fog curling away, leaving them exposed at the very gate where Morrison's message had been burned into wood. He could almost feel unseen eyes watching from the tree line. This was no place to linger. Grunting, he bent, lifted one limp body over his shoulder, and carried her to the cabin. The door groaned as he pushed it open. Dust and shadow swallowed him. the smell of old timber and mold thick in the air. Jeremiah's cabin had once been a place of promise. Now it was a tomb waiting to be filled. Not today, Elias swore. Not with them. He laid her gently on the floor, then returned for the next, and the next, until all five were stretched across the cabin's dark planks. His lungs burned. Sweat streaked his temples despite the cold. He struck a match, lit a fire in the stone hearth, and slowly the flickering glow painted their faces with life again. One by one, he examined them under the wavering light. His soldiers' eyes read the truth faster than words could tell. They had been tortured, beaten, paraded as warnings, but they weren't random victims. No, they had been chosen. Someone wanted Elias Ward to see this. Someone wanted him to inherit not just a cabin, but a war. Outside, the rope still swung from the gate, dark against the pale sky. The wind whistled through the valley, carrying the echo of a threat that was as much a promise. Inside, Elias crouched, pulling a canteen from his belt. He tilted it carefully against cracked lips. The black-haired woman drank like it was fire and water at once, her throat working greedily, eyes flickering open just long enough to lock onto his. They were the eyes of someone who had already walked through death and come back burning. Her voice, raw and broken, scraped out like a command. "Do not leave us." Elias's jaw clenched. He poured water for the next, then pressed scraps of hard bread into trembling hands. The fire popped, shadows bending across scarred faces. For the first time since cutting those ropes, Elias felt the weight of his choice settle in his chest. He could still leave. He could saddle his horse, ride out into the empty plains, and never look back. But every breath that rattled in that room told him the same truth. If he walked away, he would no longer be the man his uncle believed him to be. Elias sat back, Winchester across his lap, staring at the door. Beyond it waited Morrison's men, their brand of law and blood. Inside lay 5 strangers who had somehow already become his charge. The storm he had tried to escape after the war was rising again, right here in the valley. And deep down, Elias knew cutting those ropes wasn't just an act of mercy. It was the first shot fired in a war he had no choice but to finish. The fire snapped in the stone hearth, throwing uneasy shadows across the cabin's walls. Elias sat with his back to the door, Winchester laid across his knees, silver-gray eyes fixed on the fragile line of breathing that filled the room. 5 women, dragged from the noose by his blade, now lay sprawled on the floorboards like survivors washed ashore after a shipwreck. Their chests rose and fell, faint but steady. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm. The black-haired woman stirred first, the one he had caught when the rope gave way. Her lashes fluttered. Her throat scraped with a raw, broken sound. But her eyes, when they opened, were sharp enough to cut. Green fire gleamed beneath the bruises. She pulled herself half upright, wincing as her fingers brushed the livid mark circling her neck. Her voice came out hoarse, but every word carried the weight of command. "You realize," she rasped, "that by cutting those ropes, you've signed your own death." Before Elias could answer, another sound joined the fire's crackle, a ragged laugh, bitter and hot. The red-haired woman pushed herself upright against the wall, blue eyes blazing. Her lips split as she spoke, fury pouring out like flame through cracks. "They thought we'd choke in silence. Morrison thought stringing us up would erase what we know. He was wrong." The name struck Elias like a hammer blow. Morrison. Even before she said more, the memories flooded back, whispers from the war, tales of a judge who used a black robe as a mask for his darker trade. Debt papers, false trials, disappearances. The kind of man who wrote his law in blood. The redhead's laugh died into something colder. "He burned my home to the ground when I refused his contracts. Tried to shackle me in debt I never owed. My little sister screamed as they dragged me away. I swore that night I'd see him bleed. Her name was Ruby." Elias didn't need her to say it. Her rage carved it into the air. Beside her, the blonde girl stirred. She looked younger, her golden hair falling like a halo tarnished by dirt and blood. She clutched a worn scarf to her chest as if it were armor. Tears slipped down her cheeks as her voice shook like glass about to break. "My father was accused of stealing a horse. He didn't. Everyone knew it. But Morrison said he did, and when we couldn't pay the fine, he took me instead. My father hanged himself the next day." The words cut deeper than any blade. Elias's jaw clenched. veins straining against his neck. This girl Sadie spoke with the quiet agony of someone whose innocence had been turned into currency. From the far corner came another presence, quieter but no less dangerous. The dark-eyed woman, still weak, leaned forward. She didn't waste words. Instead, she loosened the pouch she'd kept tied against her bruised body and slid it across the floorboards toward Elias. He caught it, heavy and worn, and tipped it open. Out spilled papers, land deeds, forged seals, contracts stamped with false signatures, maps inked in secret hands. Proof. Every piece a nail in Morrison's coffin. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried like a bell in the silence. He thought hanging us would bury this, but we carry the truth, and as long as we breathe, his empire rots. Her name was Violet. Elias would not forget it. The last to speak was the older woman, chestnut hair streaked with gray. She had been silent until now, tending the others with steady hands despite her own wounds. When she finally raised her head, her eyes were calm, her voice low and carved from stone. You need to understand. Morrison isn't just a judge. He runs this valley. Every sheriff, every deputy, every clerk in the courthouse is in his pocket. He buys people, forges papers, and sells lives like cattle. We resisted. This, she gestured to the livid marks at her throat, was our punishment. Her name was Grace. And in that moment, Elias understood she was the spine that had kept the others alive through the fire. The fire popped, sending sparks into the dark. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Outside, the wind dragged across the cabin walls, carrying with it the phantom creak of ropes swaying on the gate. Elias's chest tightened, fury rising like smoke in his blood. These weren't just stories. These were war crimes, dressed up in the clothing of law. Morrison hadn't just stolen land, he had stolen lives. Elias rose to his feet, pacing once, twice, the weight of the Winchester in his hand steadying him. He'd come here for a new start, hoping the cabin would bury the soldier he'd once been. But the West, as Uncle Jeremiah used to say, never let a man lay down his rifle for long. His silver-gray eyes swept across the women, Ruby burning, Sadie trembling, Violet silent and sharp, Grace steady, and the black-haired one, Clarabelle, whose defiance glowed brightest even in pain. They weren't victims. They were witnesses. And now, whether he liked it or not, so was he. Clarabelle leaned forward, her voice quieter now, but sharper than any blade. You thought you inherited land. What you've really inherited is a battlefield. Morrison doesn't allow bystanders. You cut us down, that means you chose a side. Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. The firelight caught his face, weathered and scarred, and the steel in his gaze said everything. His anger wasn't a storm anymore. It was a vow. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied, sharp and restless. The sound carried through the fog, a warning that eyes were already on them. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, its walls thinner. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. He knew what was coming. The truth had been spoken, and truth always carried a price. The fire had burned low by dawn, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. Elias sat slumped against the cabin door, Winchester across his knees, half asleep but never at rest. He had listened through the night as each woman's breath steadied, as pain gave way to the faint rhythm of survival. Outside, the ropes still swayed in the morning wind, like ghosts refusing to leave. But when the first light broke through the fog, another sound cut through the valley, low, distant, steady. The hollow thunder of hooves. Elias's eyes snapped open. He set the rifle aside, rose slowly, and stepped onto the porch. The air was thick with mist, heavy enough to choke. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, shapes emerged from the pale gray veil, 3 black horses on the ridge above the cabin, riders mounted tall and silent. Even through the fog, Elias could feel the weight of their eyes. The man in front sat broad-shouldered in the saddle, his long coat swaying with the horse's breath. One hand rested calm on the grip of a silver revolver, as if it had been carved there. Elias didn't need an introduction. He knew. Morrison. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Clarabelle stepped out, her black hair tangled, falling across the bruised rope mark on her throat. She narrowed her eyes toward the ridge, her voice carrying the chill of the grave. It's him. He knows we lived. Ruby rushed to the window, pushing aside the tattered curtain. Her fiery hair caught the weak morning light, and her fury burned brighter than the dawn. I told you, that vulture won't let us breathe free air. Not after what we know. Oh. Inside, Sadie clutched Grace's hand, trembling. Violet stood still, her dark eyes unreadable, fixed on the figures above. Elias stayed silent. He stepped forward, boots heavy on the porch, his gaze locked with the man on the ridge. Morrison didn't move, didn't need to. The silence was his weapon. Then, slowly, more riders appeared. Out of the fog they came, one by one, until the ridge was black with men on horseback. Torches flickered among them, faint orange tongues licking at the mist. The sound of hooves grew heavier, the air vibrating with their weight. They began to spread out, circling, like wolves tightening around prey. Elias's hand found the stock of his rifle. He didn't raise it, not yet. Behind him, he could feel the women gathering at the door, drawn out by the same sound of doom that had stirred him. Grace's voice broke the silence, steady but edged with fear. You still have a way out. We do not. If you ride now, you might live. Elias didn't turn. His silver-gray eyes narrowed against the fog, his voice low and rough as gravel. I made my choice the moment I cut those ropes. Clarabelle stepped closer, a spark of defiance in her bruised face. She pressed a worn dagger into his hand. Its blade dulled, but its weight undeniable. Then hold it true. Because what stands out there isn't a posse. It's a war. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Then, like a curtain pulled back, the fog split. Morrison's horse moved forward, its hooves striking hard against the frozen dirt. He stopped just beyond the cabin's gate, the silver revolver gleaming at his side. His voice rang out over the valley, calm and sharp as steel. Ward, you think cutting them loose made you a savior? It made you a dead man. Those women belong to me. That land belongs to me. Everything you see here belongs to me. The words slithered like poison across the air. Ruby stepped forward, face flushed with rage, her fists clenched. Belong to you? We'd rather hang again than crawl at your feet. Morrison's lip curled into a sneer. He raised his voice, each syllable striking like a hammer. Hand them over. Step aside, and I'll let you ride out alive. Stand in my way, and this cabin burns with you inside. The torches behind him flared, dozens of flames swaying in the mist. The circle tightened. Inside, Sadie whimpered, clutching her scarf like a lifeline. Violet reached into her pouch, her hand brushing the forged deeds and contracts that could damn him. Grace rested a hand on Ruby's shoulder, steadying her rage. Clarabelle's eyes never left Elias. The silence that followed was heavier than the threat itself. Morrison sat tall in the saddle, confident, certain of the answer. Men like him always believed fear would break the will of others. Elias stepped forward, boots crunching over the frost, until he stood at the very edge of the porch. He raised the Winchester, not in surrender but in promise. His voice carried steady across the distance. This land belonged to Jeremiah. Now it's mine. If you want it, Morrison, you'll have to bleed for it. The air crackled. Morrison's smile vanished, his face twisting cold and sharp. He tipped his hat back, exposing eyes like a vulture's hungry, pitiless. Then he raised his revolver, tilting it skyward. The signal. All at once, the riders howled. Torches lifted high, flames tearing through the fog as they surged forward. The circle collapsed into a tide of hooves and steel, bearing down on the cabin like a flood unleashed. Inside, the women armed themselves with whatever Elias had laid out the night before an old Colt pressed into Ruby's hand. A sawed-off shotgun given to trembling Sadie. Violet with her hunting knife, Grace gripping a musket, Clarabelle with a Navy Colt resting steady in her grasp. The cabin walls shook with the first impact of hooves against the earth. Gunmetal gleamed through the mist. Elias's heart pounded, but his voice stayed calm. We hold, we fight, and we finish this. The roar of riders crashed closer, closer, until the valley itself seemed to tremble. Morrison's ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Hand them over, and live. Stand, and die. Elias chambered around, the metallic click loud as thunder. Behind him, 5 pairs of eyes burned with the fire of survival. He had already made his choice. The first shot cracked the air like lightning. A bullet splintered the gatepost, showering frost and wood across the porch. Elias ducked back inside, slamming the cabin door shut. In an instant, the world erupted. Gunfire roared from every side, windows shattering into shards that rained across the floor. "Positions!" Elias barked, his voice steady despite the chaos. The cabin trembled beneath the thunder of hooves and the shrill screams of riders circling like wolves. Ruby was the first to answer. Her fiery hair flew wild as she leveled the Colt Elias had pressed into her hand. Fury flared in her blue eyes. She leaned into the window frame and fired. The shot ripped through the mist, and a rider toppled from his saddle with a howl. Ruby laughed bitterly, the sound half triumph, half rage. "Come on, bastards! I'll send you to hell myself." At the next window, Sadi shook so hard the shotgun wobbled in her hands. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. Elias caught her gaze for half a second, his silver-gray eyes anchoring her. "Breathe," he said low. "Wait until you see them." "Ah." The moment came fast, a shadow looming in the window, revolver raised. Sadi screamed, squeezed the trigger, and the blast tore the door clean off its hinges, hurling the gunman backward in a spray of red. She dropped the shotgun, gasping, her body trembling, but her eyes locked with Elias's. She had done it. Violet moved like a shadow herself. While the others fired, she slipped into the darkest corner, knife gleaming in her grip. When a raider broke through the half-shattered window, Violet struck. Quick, silent, merciless. The blade sank deep, the man's eyes wide with shock before he collapsed. Violet dragged him aside without a word, her dark eyes unblinking. Grace, the eldest, kept her ground at the rear. She tore open a jar of kerosene Elias had stored in the cabin, her hands moving with the calm of a woman who had seen storms before. She lit the rag, flung it through the broken shutters, and flames roared up outside. Horses reared, men cursed, the circle of riders staggering under the sudden wall of fire. "Burn, you devils," she whispered, reloading the musket with steady fingers. And then there was Clarabelle. She moved like she'd been born with a pistol in her hand. Every shot from her Navy Colt was precise, controlled, green eyes blazing in the smoke. She fought at Elias's side, their movements wordless but in rhythm, as if they'd known each other all their lives. When Elias ducked, she rose. When he reloaded, she fired. Together, they became the iron heart of the defense. The cabin groaned under the onslaught. Bullets tore through its walls, gun smoke filling the room until it was hard to breathe. Horses screamed outside. Torches flared. Shadows leapt across the timber like demons. Still, the six of them held. Elias worked the Winchester's lever, calm as stone. One shot dropped a rider scrambling onto the porch. Another pierced the chest of a man trying to set fire to the shutters. He moved with the cold precision of a soldier, every breath measured, every bullet a verdict. Clarabelle's voice cut through the storm. "They're falling back!" But even as she spoke, Morrison's voice rose above the chaos, commanding, unshaken. "Push them. Break that door. Burn them out." The riders surged again. One crashed through the window in a spray of glass, landing hard on the cabin floor. Ruby kicked him in the face, fired point blank, and he went still. Sadi shrieked as another burst through the broken doorway, but Grace swung the butt of her musket like a hammer, dropping him where he stood. Outside, the flames from Grace's kerosene jar spread across the field, casting a hellish glow. The mist turned blood red, shadows of horse and rider dancing like phantoms. The smell of smoke and gunpowder thickened, choking the air. Through it all, Elias and Clarabelle stood shoulder to shoulder. When his Winchester jammed, she covered him with sharp, clean shots. When her Colt clicked empty, he shoved his knife into her hand without hesitation. They fought as one, bound not by words but by fire and survival. The battle stretched on, each second an eternity. Screams, gunshots, the clash of steel. The cabin shook as men hurled themselves against it, only to fall back broken. And yet, with every attack repelled, Elias knew the truth they could not hold forever. Then, a sudden crack of torch smashed through the window, flames spilling across the floorboards. Smoke surged upward, filling the cabin with choking heat. Elias cursed, grabbed the torch with his bare hand, and hurled it back out, his palm blistering instantly. Clarabelle grabbed his arm, steadying him. Their eyes locked, both of them knowing this night would not end without blood. Outside, the riders faltered. Bodies lay scattered across the frost, horses whinnied in terror, and the fire Grace had started hemmed them in. Still, Morrison sat tall in his saddle, revolver gleaming, eyes cold as iron. He raised his voice again, carrying above the dying chaos. You think you've won something here? All you've done is dig a bigger grave. Ward, hand them over now, and maybe I'll let you crawl away. Inside, the women gathered, chests heaving, faces streaked with sweat and soot. Ruby spat blood onto the floor. Tell him to come dig it himself. Sadi clutched her scarf tighter, eyes wet but burning. Violet wiped her knife clean with steady hands. Grace reloaded, silent, unshakable. Clarabelle stood with Elias. Her Colt aimed steady at the shadow of Morrison on his horse. Elias chambered another round, the metallic snap echoing like thunder in the smoldering cabin. His voice came low, raw, unbending. This land isn't yours. Not anymore. The night was far from over. But the cabin had already become something more than wood and nails. It was a fortress, a crucible, a place where 6 souls had chosen to defy the darkness. And outside, Morrison's circle tightened once more, the firelight painting his men's faces with hunger for blood. The real storm was just beginning. The cabin still shook with smoke and the stink of gunpowder. Bodies littered the frost outside, shadows of dying horses staggering against the fire's glow. Inside, Elias and the 5 women stood bloodied, weapons heavy in their hands, but unbroken. Through the haze, Morrison finally stepped forward. He walked slowly, silver revolver gleaming at his side, black coat billowing like a preacher at a funeral. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes glowed with fury. He stopped just beyond the ruined gate, his voice rising over the crackle of flames. Ward, you think you saved them? All you've done is dig your own grave. Around here, the law is what I say it is. Elias pushed himself onto the porch, shoulder bleeding, rifle steady in his grip. His voice, hoarse from smoke, carried like rolling thunder. This land belonged to Jeremiah. Now it's mine, and no man owns another's life. Not while I'm standing. Behind him, Clarabelle moved to his side. Her black hair clung to her bruised cheek, but her green eyes burned. She pulled a crumpled stack of papers from her coat and raised her voice so every man on the ridge could hear. You call yourself judge? This is the truth. Forged deeds, false seals, contracts that prove you stole half this valley. The riders stirred uneasily. Morrison sneered, his voice sharp as a whip. Paper won't save you when I still hold the gun. Then Violet stepped into the firelight, pulling a silver locket from her pouch. The delicate engraving glimmered. She held it high. Do you remember this, Morrison? It belonged to Margaret, your wife. She's alive. And she told us everything how you faked your death to steal her father's mine, how you sold women like cattle to cover your lies. For the first time, Morrison's face faltered. His sneer cracked. He barked back, desperate. Lies. That woman's been dead 5 years. Grace's voice rang out from the doorway, firm as steel. We saw her. In Denver. 3 weeks ago. She signed a sworn statement. And the marshal has it now. The night went still. The riders shifted, doubt breaking their line. And then hoofbeats, new ones, rising from the valley road. Dozens of them. The fog parted, revealing men in long coats, badges gleaming silver in the firelight. The marshal's posse. Elias lowered his rifle slightly, his breath harsh but steady. Morrison's face drained of color as the law he had bought and bent for years now stood against him. The marshal himself, a gray-bearded man with eyes sharp as knives, rode forward and dismounted. He looked at Elias, then at the 5 women, then at Morrison. Justice may come late, the marshal said, voice grave. But it comes. The last of Morrison's men lowered their heads, shame seeping into the cracks of their fear. None dared move when the marshal's deputies disarmed them. Morrison, still clutching his revolver, roared like a cornered beast. He raised the weapon toward Clarabelle. Time froze. Elias lunged, shoving her aside as he raised the Winchester. 2 shots exploded. Morrison's gun spun from his hand as Elias's bullet slammed into his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The so-called judge knelt in the dirt, his coat torn, his eyes burning with a hatred stripped of power. Ruby stepped forward, Colt raised, her voice like fire. Your time's up, Morrison. From this day on, it's you who'll hang. The marshal's men seized him, binding his hands tight. Morrison struggled, cursed, but his words no longer held weight. He was just another criminal dragged away under the moonlight, his empire of fear collapsing into dust. When the last hoofbeats faded and the valley grew quiet, Elias stood on the porch, smoke rising behind him. He looked at the women Ruby's rage, Sadi's tears, Violet's calm, Grace's steadiness, Clarabelle's defiance. They were no longer strangers. They were bound together by fire, blood, and survival. 3 days later, when the ashes cooled, they rebuilt the cabin gate. Each board nailed in place was more than wood, it was a vow. Ruby took charge of the horses, her fiery spirit unbroken. Sadi replanted the garden out front, her fragile hands steady with new purpose. Violet sorted through the evidence, preparing it for the courts. Grace kept the ledger, her voice guiding the work with stern warmth. And Clarabelle, she stood beside Elias at sunset, her green eyes catching the fading light, fierce and alive. One night, as the fire burned low, Elias looked around the small cabin. His voice cracked like a log splitting in the hearth. Some ropes are made to kill, but when you find the courage to cut them, they become the ties that bind. I thought I inherited a cabin, but the truth is I inherited all of you. No one answered. Only Clarabelle placed her hand gently over his, her eyes glowing in the dark. And in that silence, Elias knew. This land was no longer just soil and timber. It was family. The ropes that once swayed with death had become the bonds of life. The valley lay quiet beneath the silver light of the moon. Smoke from the battle had thinned, leaving only the scent of ash and the cold hush of night. Where once 5 ropes had swayed with death, now only embers glowed, a reminder of the storm that had passed. Inside the rebuilt cabin, the fire crackled softly. Elias sat with the Winchester laid across his knees, but for the first time, it felt lighter, as if the burden of war had shifted into something else. Around him, the women moved with purpose. Ruby's laughter, sharp and fiery, echoed as she tended the horses. Sadi's gentle hands pressed new seeds into the earth. Violet's quiet focus lingered over papers that would bring truth to the courts. Grace's voice carried steady wisdom as she guided the work. And Clarabelle stood beside Elias, her presence fierce and unyielding, a flame that refused to die. Elias looked at them, his voice steady and low. Some ropes are meant to kill, but when you cut them, they can become the ties that bind. The West had given him no peace, but it had given him something greater: family, born not of blood, but of choice. And that choice was freedom.